The pattern never announces itself. It arrives quietly, dressed as progress, stability, and success. Long before the damage is visible, the foundations are already shifting beneath daily life. In every era that believed itself advanced enough to escape history, the same sequence unfolded with unnerving precision. Wealth accumulated faster than productivity. Financial claims grew detached from real output. Risk dispersed so widely it appeared to vanish. And confidence, once earned through discipline, became assumed as a permanent condition. At first, the system rewards everyone. Asset prices rise, credit becomes easier, complexity increases, not to create resilience, but to disguise fragility. Institutions expand, intermediaries multiply, and leverage becomes normalized as a sign of sophistication rather than danger. Those closest to the system interpret this expansion as proof of strength. Those who question it are dismissed as outdated, pessimistic, or incapable of understanding modern conditions. History records this phase generously. It looks like prosperity. It feels like momentum. It convinces participants that past limits no longer apply. But beneath the surface, the structure begins to change. Capital flows faster than goods. Financial innovation outpaces productive investment. Returns become increasingly dependent on rising prices rather than rising output. Debt fills the gap left by stagnating real growth. The system becomes efficient at circulating wealth, but increasingly poor at creating it. Over time, maintaining stability requires ever larger interventions, each one framed as temporary, each one becoming permanent. This pattern has appeared in empires fueled by silver, in republics financed by bonds, in industrial powers driven by credit, and in modern economies built on financial engineering. The names change, the instruments evolve, the incentives remain constant. Expansion is rewarded, prudence is penalized, risk is socialized while gains remain concentrated. The system does not collapse because participants are unaware. It collapses because awareness alone cannot overcome incentives. What makes the pattern especially dangerous is its gradualism. There is no single moment when confidence breaks. There is no clear line between stability and instability. Instead, the system moves through stages so slowly that each adjustment feels rational in isolation. Extraordinary measures become routine. Temporary imbalances become structural features. By the time stress becomes visible, the system has already committed itself to a narrow range of outcomes. In every historical example, the final phase arrives not with panic, but with reassurance. Official narratives emphasize resilience. Volatility is reframed as strength. Declining fundamentals are offset with expanding liquidity. Participants are encouraged to stay invested, stay calm, stay confident. And for a time it works. Prices hold. Faith persists. The appearance of control remains intact. Until it doesn't. When the break finally comes, it is rarely triggered by a single event. It emerges from accumulated strain, finally exceeding the system's capacity to absorb it. What follows feels sudden only to those who ignored the earlier stages. To historians, it is simply the last act of a very old script. And once the pattern reaches this point, the ending is no longer a matter of choice. Collapse, in reality, does not look like chaos at first. It looks like normalization. Markets continue to function. Institutions remain open. Contracts are honored. Daily life proceeds with only subtle distortions. The misconception is that systemic failure announces itself through political upheaval or military conflict. History shows the opposite. Large-scale collapse begins economically, quietly, and almost politely. The earliest stage is imbalance. Incentives shift in ways that favor financial extraction over productive contribution. Capital becomes more profitable than labor. Speculation outpaces investment. Growth persists, but it becomes increasingly narrow, dependent on asset appreciation rather than expanding output. Productivity slows, yet consumption remains high, supported by credit rather than income. This stage often lasts for years, sometimes decades, because it rewards those closest to the system. The second stage is distortion. To sustain momentum, monetary and financial tools are pushed beyond their original purpose. Interest rates suppress risk signals. Liquidity replaces discipline. Markets lose their ability to price danger accurately. Success becomes measured by financial performance rather than real-world resilience. The system grows larger but weaker as complexity masks fragility. The third stage is dependence. Stability now requires continuous intervention. What once would have been considered emergency measures become embedded into normal operations. Institutions adapt their behavior around these supports, assuming they will persist indefinitely. Risk-taking increases precisely because consequences appear manageable. This is not recklessness, it is rational behavior within a distorted incentive structure. The fourth stage is saturation. Debt reaches levels that no longer accelerate growth. Each new unit of credit produces diminishing returns. Productivity stagnates further, but expectations remain elevated. Asset values diverge sharply from underlying economic capacity. The system continues to function, but only by recycling capital internally rather than expanding outward. Wealth circulates rapidly, but increasingly among fewer participants. The fifth stage is denial. Warning signs become visible, but they are reframed. Volatility is explained away. Structural weaknesses are attributed to temporary shocks. Narratives emphasize innovation, adaptability, and exceptionalism. Faith in the system's uniqueness replaces empirical analysis. At this point, reform becomes politically and institutionally impossible because acknowledging the problem threatens the legitimacy of those in control. The final stage is irreversibility. Confidence erodes not gradually, but asymmetrically. Small disruptions produce outsized reactions. Liquidity no longer stabilizes markets. It amplifies instability. Trust between institutions weakens. Participants begin to prioritize exit over optimization. The system has not collapsed yet, but it has lost its flexibility. From here, outcomes narrow rapidly. What defines this framework is not collapse itself, but the long period during which collapse becomes inevitable while still appearing avoidable. Every system that has failed followed this path in some form, not because leaders were ignorant, but because the structure rewarded continuation over correction. Once a system reaches this point, the forces driving it forward are stronger than any individual decision to stop it. The Roman Empire offers one of the clearest examples of how a dominant system can hollow itself out while appearing unassailable. At its height, Rome commanded unmatched advantages. It controlled vast territory, enforced standardized law, maintained disciplined institutions, and built infrastructure that unified trade across continents. Wealth flowed into the empire from every direction: grain from Egypt, silver from Hispania, goods from Asia. For centuries, Rome converted expansion into stability. But expansion altered Rome's internal mechanics. As borders stretched outward, maintaining them grew increasingly expensive. Military spending rose faster than productive output. Rather than adjust commitments, Rome adjusted its money. Silver content in the denarius was gradually reduced. Each debasement was small, justified, and framed as temporary. But over time, the currency lost credibility. Prices rose, savings eroded, trust weakened. Debt accumulation followed. The state promised more than it could sustainably extract through taxation without destabilizing society. To compensate, it relied on monetary distortion. This allowed Rome to maintain appearances while quietly transferring cost onto the population. Wealth continued to move through the empire, but it no longer remained within productive channels. It pooled among elites, financiers, and intermediaries who were structurally insulated from decline. Productivity suffered. Small landowners were displaced by large estates worked by enslaved labor, reducing innovation and long-term output. Urban populations swelled, dependent on state distributions rather than economic contribution. Consumption stayed high, but it was increasingly disconnected from production. Rome became efficient at redistribution, but poor at regeneration. Social consequences followed predictably. As confidence in money declined, barter increased. Taxes were collected in goods rather than currency. Soldiers demanded payment in kind. The economy fragmented regionally as trust in centralized systems eroded. To maintain order, the state expanded bureaucracy and control, increasing administrative costs without increasing productivity. Crucially, Rome did not fall because it lacked resources. It fell because its incentive structure rewarded extraction over sustainability. Each short-term solution made the next problem harder to solve. Discipline gave way to dependency. Expansion gave way to preservation. Innovation gave way to maintenance. By the time external pressures intensified, the internal system was already compromised. Trade networks weakened, infrastructure decayed, monetary confidence collapsed. Wealth still existed, but it no longer circulated in ways that strengthened the system as a whole. It moved quickly at the top, while stagnating everywhere else. The final outcome was not a sudden disappearance, but a long decline. Authority fragmented. Economic complexity regressed. Living standards fell. Rome's collapse looked less like destruction and more like exhaustion. What makes Rome instructive is not its antiquity, but its familiarity. A system rich in assets, reliant on financial adjustment, and confident in its permanence gradually lost the very mechanisms that made it resilient. And like every system before it, Rome believed its scale and sophistication made it different, right up until the pattern completed itself. In the early 20th century, another system reached a similar moment under very different conditions. The German economy following the First World War was not an ancient empire stretched across continents. It was a modern, industrialized state with advanced engineering, skilled labor, and deep integration into global finance. Its leaders believed that modern economics, administered by experts, could bend outcomes away from historical precedent. The initial strain came from obligation rather than overextension. War reparations imposed costs far beyond Germany's immediate productive capacity. Rather than restructure those obligations directly, policymakers turned to monetary expansion. At first, the effects appeared manageable. Credit eased pressure, employment recovered, industrial activity resumed. The system seemed to be adapting, but adaptation masked distortion. As money supply expanded faster than output, price signals weakened. Debt obligations became easier to service nominally, but harder in real terms. Savings eroded quietly. Confidence remained because daily commerce continued. People adjusted behavior rather than resisting policy. This is how inflation embeds itself socially long before it becomes visible statistically. Denial followed predictably. Officials emphasized recovery and modernization. Financial complexity increased. Short-term capital flows replaced long-term investment. The belief that external confidence would persist indefinitely became central to policy. When instability appeared, it was attributed to political noise or foreign pressure, never to internal imbalance. The familiar stages accelerated. Dependence on monetary intervention grew. Each round of expansion required a larger follow-up to maintain the same effect. Productivity lagged while consumption patterns persisted. Real wages fell behind prices, but credit bridged the gap. The economy functioned, but it no longer healed itself. When confidence finally broke, it did not fracture evenly. Those closest to financial instruments exited first. Ordinary citizens absorbed the loss through currency collapse. Hyperinflation was not the cause of the breakdown. It was the visible symptom of a system that had already crossed into irreversibility. Once trust in money dissolved, contracts failed, trade ceased, and social cohesion deteriorated rapidly. What makes this episode particularly instructive is how firmly its participants believed that history had been outgrown. Germany was technologically advanced. Its economists were among the most respected in the world. Its financial tools were modern, and yet the same pattern asserted itself. Imbalance led to distortion. Distortion created dependence. Dependence eliminated flexibility. The outcome was not simply economic. Political extremism flourished in the vacuum left by financial collapse. Institutions lost legitimacy. Social order became fragile. The economic failure cascaded into every other domain, precisely because the economy is where collapse begins. Different century, different tools, same sequence. The lesson is not that inflation or debt automatically destroys systems. It is that once confidence replaces discipline as the primary stabilizer, the margin for error disappears. And when belief finally fails, it does so all at once. The modern financial system operates on a scale and speed that would have been unimaginable to Rome or Weimar Germany, but its underlying structure is not new. It is built on confidence, leverage, and the assumption that liquidity can substitute for restraint. Over the past several decades, growth has become increasingly dependent on financial expansion rather than productive expansion. Debt has risen faster than output. Asset prices have grown faster than incomes. Complexity has increased faster than transparency. This is not the result of conspiracy or incompetence. It is the logical outcome of incentives. When economic slowdowns are met with intervention rather than adjustment, participants adapt their behavior accordingly. Risk is not eliminated, it is redistributed. Losses are deferred. Price discovery weakens. Markets become conditioned to expect support, and systems evolve around that expectation. Productivity growth, the foundation of sustainable expansion, has steadily decelerated even as financial markets have reached record valuations. Capital increasingly flows toward existing assets rather than new capacity. Innovation remains visible, but its economic impact concentrates rather than diffuses. Consumption continues, supported by credit, while real purchasing power becomes more unevenly distributed. Wealth moves rapidly through financial channels, but less of it remains anchored in productive investment. Confidence plays a central role. Modern markets function not because risk is absent, but because it is believed to be manageable. Sophisticated instruments, global coordination, and institutional credibility create the impression of control. Volatility is smoothed, drawdowns are shortened, stability appears engineered. Over time, this perceived stability becomes an input into decision-making itself, encouraging leverage, duration mismatch, and fragile interdependence. The system grows efficient at maintaining prices, but less capable of absorbing shocks. Small disturbances are neutralized quickly, while larger imbalances accumulate beneath the surface. The longer this persists, the more painful adjustment becomes, because fewer mechanisms remain to release pressure gradually. Crucially, failure in modern systems does not begin with panic. It begins with misaligned incentives that reward continuation over correction. Institutions act rationally within the framework they are given. Policymakers respond to immediate threats rather than long-term consequences. Participants optimize for short-term performance because survival depends on it. No single actor controls the outcome, yet the outcome becomes increasingly constrained. History shows that systems fail not when intentions turn malicious, but when incentives no longer align with sustainability. Once growth depends more on belief than on output, fragility becomes structural. The system can persist for years in this state, appearing resilient, adaptive, even strong. But resilience without flexibility is an illusion. And when flexibility is exhausted, stability itself becomes the risk. Late-stage systems always feel safest just before they break. This is not coincidence. It is the final expression of risk normalization. By this stage, participants have lived through repeated warnings that never materialized into catastrophe. Each near miss reinforces confidence. Each intervention confirms the belief that instability is controllable. Over time, the absence of collapse becomes evidence that collapse is impossible. Institutions play a central role in this perception. Stability is actively curated through communication, policy coordination, and narrative discipline. Language shifts. Risks become contained. Stress becomes transitory. Structural weakness is reframed as adaptation. This is not deception in the crude sense. It is coherence maintenance. Systems under strain prioritize continuity of belief because belief itself has become a stabilizing input. As a result, behavior adjusts in dangerous ways. Leverage feels safer because it has been safe. Duration extends because short-term disruptions have been absorbed before. Concentration increases because diversification appears inefficient in a managed environment. Each of these choices is defensible on its own. Together, they compress the system's margin for error. Warnings still appear, but they are discounted. Analysts who emphasize structural risk are tolerated as background noise rather than treated as signals. Historical comparisons are dismissed as irrelevant to modern complexity. Data that contradicts confidence is explained away through technical nuance. Action is deferred not because leaders are unaware, but because acting too early carries immediate cost, while waiting preserves the appearance of stability. This is the acceleration phase. Not because events move faster on the surface, but because internal adjustments lose effectiveness. Interventions that once restored confidence now require larger scale to achieve smaller results. Liquidity that once calmed markets begins to distort them, signals weaken, feedback loops tighten. Eventually, the system reaches a point where reassurance no longer reassures. Confidence does not erode evenly, it fractures. Some participants move first, quietly reducing exposure. Others follow once price signals shift. Institutions designed to dampen volatility instead transmit it. What had been normalized risk suddenly reveals itself as accumulated fragility. At this stage, options narrow rapidly. The tools that sustained the system now constrain it. Choices become binary: preserve confidence at all costs, or accept adjustment that confidence can no longer survive. And once that threshold is crossed, events no longer unfold at the pace of policy or intention, but at the pace of trust. Every era believes it is standing at the center of history rather than inside a cycle. The technologies differ. The institutions evolve. The language becomes more refined. But the underlying behaviors remain remarkably consistent. Systems expand until the incentives that sustain them begin to erode the foundations they depend on. Not because participants are malicious or foolish, but because they respond logically to the structures placed in front of them. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because learning does not change incentives. Knowledge alone cannot override the rewards of expansion or the penalties of restraint. When short-term stability is valued above long-term resilience, the future is quietly traded away one rational decision at a time. What ultimately determines the outcome of late-stage systems is not intelligence, morality, or effort. It is alignment. When productivity, reward, and risk share the same direction, systems compound sustainably. When they diverge, systems compensate with leverage, narrative, and belief. These tools can delay adjustment, sometimes for years, but they cannot eliminate it. Collapse, when it comes, is rarely dramatic at first. It feels like confusion, like volatility without resolution, like institutions doing exactly what they were designed to do, only to discover that their design no longer fits reality. The damage is uneven. Those closest to financial flows adapt fastest. Those furthest absorb the cost. Wealth still exists. It simply moves differently. Understanding this does not grant control over outcomes. It grants perspective. It allows observers to recognize patterns without assuming immunity. It tempers confidence without replacing it with fear. It frames instability not as an anomaly, but as a feature of cyclical systems under strain. The uncomfortable truth is that preparation is never encouraged during periods of apparent stability. It is discouraged precisely because stability depends on participation. Questioning the structure threatens the structure. And so the pattern continues, reinforced by incentives that reward belief over balance. History offers no villains here, only recurring behavior, playing out under new conditions, guided by the same pressures it always has. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.